Here is a simple but effective sewing kit. It comprises a number of colours of upholstery cotton, a selection of curved needles, a good strong thimble, a pair of tweezers, a pair of scissors or snips, and some sort of a little carry bag. Also handy to have on hand is a tube of super glue, which normally you'd have in your general kit anyway. Here's a simple way to thread a needle when you have either very badly frayed cotton that you need to get through the eye, or when you've got a very short piece that you need to get through the eye. You can buy a steel wire device that does it, but I've found that they break pretty quickly. So this is a simple way to do it with a piece of cotton. There are usually two main types of hand stitching required. One is joining of the two pieces of fabric or leather together, and then there's the top stitching, which is more of a decorative type of stitching, and in that case colour and the weight of the thread are important to be matched as closely as possible. Here we have an example of a mechanical stitch that's broken. That is a stitch that is joining two pieces of leather, requires strength and does not need to be completely accurate in your colour match of thread. It's important to use the existing holes to do your repair. It's almost impossible to get a needle through the leather by hand. What's important is to make sure that you match the correct holes opposite each other so that when the thread is pulled tight, the leather comes back together and matches in position and doesn't cause any excessive wrinkling. So work out which holes line up before you start. That will make your job a lot easier. There are a couple of important things to consider before you start. One is to work out what each of the loose threads are doing and to figure out a way to anchor those threads, whether it's by tying off or whether it's by joining to your new thread. You need to plan in advance which end of the break you're going to start, which allows you the easiest way to finish off and which allows you the easiest way to tie off. So work it out in your mind first, where you'll start, how you'll anchor these loose threads and what each thread is doing. Once you've determined where you'll start, where you'll finish and how you'll tie the threads off and chosen the best matching thread that you have, the next thing to do is to make sure that you use plenty of cotton. Don't save a cent by cutting the cotton short. There's nothing worse than getting to the last inch or even last stitch and not having enough cotton to finish the job. Allow for plenty of slack. You don't want to pull the job tight until the end, and so you're going to need a lot more cotton than the length of the stitching. As mentioned earlier, you need to work out where you'll start and where you'll finish. You also need to make sure that you start the cotton in the correct hole. If you've determined that you'll tie the two pieces of cotton together, then you need to start the cotton in a hole so that it is opposite the loose thread. That enables you to pull the knot tight once the job is done, and the pieces of thread will be opposite each other and they'll pull the seam together. So now I've chosen which hole I'll start the sewing in so that a thread is left hanging out opposite the broken thread, which can be tied off later. Go into the hole that you're going to start on and out of the adjacent hole. So in the first hole and out the adjacent hole. Now go into the hole opposite the last hole you came out of. So on the opposite piece of material, into the hole and then out the adjacent hole on that piece. Make sure that the cotton doesn't get tangled up or on the wrong side of the needle. It needs to be a clean threading backwards and forwards from one side to the other, back and forwards, without the loose cotton getting caught up. So the next step will be to go into the hole opposite the last one that you came out of and then out of the adjacent hole as previously done. As you can see, you're zigzagging your way along the broken line, hole by hole, zigzagging one side to the other, in one hole, out the adjacent hole, across to the hole opposite, out the adjacent hole, repeating this until you come to the end. Once you get to the end, just like in the beginning, you need to finish your last stitch so that it is opposite the loose thread if you intend to tie the threads together and tie them off that way. If it doesn't work out that way, you may have to unpick one stitch or two stitches of the broken thread so that you can do one more stitch on the repair thread to come out of the correct hole opposite the hole of the broken thread. Once you are happy with the way the job has gone and the threads are coming out of the correct hole, you can pull them up tightly, and pull the seam together. If it's a long join, you may have to pull them up in stages using a needle or a pair of tweezers to hook into the thread to pull 2 or 3 sections together at a time, progressively go along the seam until the whole lot is pulled up nice and tight. Tying off the loose threads can sometimes be a bit tricky, particularly if one or both of the threads are short. I usually use a pair of tweezers, which makes it a lot easier. Once the knots are tied, you can pull up the loose end at the far end of the repair to pull up any slack. The tails can be pulled back down into the job and trimmed later on. Once the loose ends have been tied off, we need to get rid of the tails. This is usually best achieved by pulling the threads back down into the inside of the job. Feed the needle back into the seam adjacent to the knot. Try and bring the needle back out a simple way, preferably through the seam again, some distance from where it's gone in. This way you can pull the thread down and into the job and let it tail off as you pull the needle back out. It helps if you can feed the needle back out through the gap between the seams, but if it's not possible, sometimes you have to force it out through the fabric. This makes it a little harder. Sometimes you'll also find that the thread pops out of the hole. It's been longer than needed. That just needs to be trimmed off. Repeat the process at the other end, and there's your finished product. As mentioned at the beginning, the other type of stitching that needs to be repaired is top stitching. This is an example of top stitching where it's also attaching the zipper to the cushion, but the same principle applies no matter whether it's just decorative top stitching or if it's, in this case, attaching a zipper. You have to be more careful in your matching of cotton, both the underneath cotton and the cotton that's visible. There are 2 ways to do top stitching. The method is much the same, but the requirements depend on whether there is any leftover original cotton that you can use in the repair rather than having to match that original cotton. If you're lucky, there'll be a length of cotton hanging out that will be sufficient to be able to do the job, and no one will ever know the difference. If there isn't any cotton left over, here's a way to make it look fairly good. I'm using black thread just so that it's easy to see. This method starts by going in one hole and out the adjacent hole, back into the first hole and out the second hole, one past the original. That way you form a loop which is visible on top, and you can keep going forward 2, back 1, forward 2, back 1 until you go along the full length of the missing stitching. To try and keep the needle point from going through the thread you're using. If it does go through, it tends to make it harder to tighten the stitches up at the end to make them look nice and tight and firm. As in all hand stitching, you need to plan how you're going to finish and start and lock off your threads. Here are some ways to lock off the threads. You can tie them, you can sew them back in under, and you can glue them. Gluing can be quite effective. The most important part is to make sure the glue gets to where you need it. I use a needle with a drop of glue on it to be able to accurately position the needle point into the hole, let the glue run off the tip of the needle, wet the thread and seal everything in the hole. Once it's dry, you can trim any little bits of thread that are hanging out, and as you can see, it's quite a strong bond. When there is original thread left to do the repair, what we need to do is just pull that thread down into each hole. This is done by using a repair thread which is fed up through the hole, over the existing thread, and down back through the same hole, then out of the adjacent hole, over the existing thread again, down the same hole, out the adjacent hole, and so on. Again, try not to split either of the threads with the needle. This makes it a lot harder to pull up and give a neat finish. Again, as in all cases, you need to have figured out how you're going to anchor or tie off your threads. Mostly in these cases, it will be possible to either sew the thread back down underneath somewhere or tie it off to the existing broken thread.